Welcome to another edition of Up in the Air, a discussion on inclusion and pride. Today's discussion is a collaboration between Blind Pride International and Bold Blind Beauty. I am Stephanie McCoy, a 60-year-old medium brown skinned Black woman with short dark hair. I'm wearing a black tee adorned with braille beading created with silver Swarovski crystal pearls. And it actually says on it, and I'm not sure if you can see it with my camera, how it's angled, but it says, fashion is for everyone. I'm pairing it with a multicolored ankle length duster and my favorite black leather leaf earrings. I'm the founder of Bold Blind Beauty, where real beauty transcends barriers, and it gives me great pleasure to allow our panel to introduce themselves. So I will now turn it over to my Chief Communications Officer, Nazreen Buddha, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Steph. Appreciate that. Hi, everyone. I'm Nazreen. I reside in Toronto, Canada, and I am a biscuit cream-colored lady, sort of South Asian descent, with a yellow undertone, with red rimmed glasses. I have auburn brown hair with highlights of gold in it. I'm wearing a light pink, dusty colored chiffon top with ruffled sleeves. And I am proud to be here today for this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazreen. Anthony, as our moderator, would you like to go next, and then we'll allow our summer interns to introduce themselves?
Absolutely. Hi, I am Anthony Corona, like the beer, not the virus. I am from Miami, Florida, and I am wearing a black Mickey Mouse Pride t-shirt. So I'm told, I have no vision, but I'm told that it is the bandana that you'd wear on your head to have the ears, and the bandana and the ears are in a rainbow pattern. I have dark, almost black hair that's spiked out. Hazel green eyes. I'm told I am devastatingly gorgeous. And I choose to believe that. So I really look forward to moderating this panel.
Thank you, Anthony. Christine, would you like to go next, please?
Hi, thanks, Steph. Hi, I'm Christine Barossi, one of the summer interns at Bold Blind Beauty. I am a 23 pale-skinned, blonde-haired Caribbean woman who is wearing tortoiseshell glasses, a simple V-neck black shirt, and some blue pants. And I'm really looking forward to being on this panel today.
Thank you, Christine. Marta, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Marta DeVito. I live in Sterling Heights, Michigan. I am a 4'9" Caucasian woman with shoulder-length brown hair with red highlights. I'm wearing a pink t-shirt and tortoiseshell glasses with a little bit of blue in them, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Thank you, Marta. Ryan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Maxwell. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I am an African-American with some shaggy facial hair, and I have dark black hair with a little bit of gray in it on my head, styled in some long curls. Right now, I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and a red shirt.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Anthony.
Hi, so we want to talk today about inclusion, about the changing attitudes towards the LGBTQ community, as well as other varying gender identities. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to throw the first, which is probably going to be the easiest question of today's panel, to Marta. Marta, when you hear LGBTQ, do you know what those letters represent?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell the folks?
Okay. The L stands for lesbian. The Q stands for questioning. The B stands for bisexual.
There you go. Not bicycle.
And yeah.
How
And the
about the
P
T? What is?
stands. The P.
Well,
It
it's T
stands.
for transsexual or
Oh,
transgender,
T. Yes.
which most, in today's day and age, most people call themselves transgender. Transsexual is a
Yeah.
term that's not really used that much anymore. And the Q can be either queer or questioning. I've
Yeah.
also heard somebody say, well, it stands for quasi. And I said, all right, you're giving us too many letters that we have to know here. Let's stick with queer and questioning.
Yeah, there's a lot of different letters.
So I'm gonna jump this around a little bit. Ryan, when you hear LGBTQ, what comes to mind?
Well, when I hear those terms, I think of gender minorities and sexual minorities. So meaning anyone who does not fall into the category of being cisgendered and being heterosexual. Oftentimes, some people do like to associate LGBTQ plus with folks who are any sort of minority when it comes to sex and gender. And I think that's what kind of comes to mind is people who don't fit into the typical idea of what a person means in terms of gender and sexuality.
You actually used another term that I was going to get to in a few minutes, but since you raised it, tell us what does cis stand for?
Oh, I am actually not sure what cis stands for. I think it just means you're born with a body, and as you grow up, you realize that your brain and your soul and your spirit matches that body that you were born with. I'm not sure what it stands for, SIS, really.
Well, that definition is perfect. So I'm going to jump to Christine. What other terminologies have you heard of out there that might fall into the LGBTQ, what we call the spectrum?
Well, of course, there's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, but they've added more letters like asexual, pansexual, of course, questioning. And there has just been a lot of talk about sexual identity and how we're in a sexual revolution, really, because there's been greater acceptance of the LGBTQ plus community. So from what I've heard on social media, asexual, pansexual, questioning, queer, and then bi, pan, bi, lesbian, and terminology like that.
Absolutely. And a lot of those second set of terms that you used cover gender fluidity or gender non-binary, which are some terms that people will hear out there and possibly within this conversation today. So I'm going to ask all three of you, and either, any one of you feel free to chime in first. You mentioned sexual revolution, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think a lot of folks will think about the first sexual revolution, which was the late 60s and all through the 70s, where it was, sort of free to be me and free to do what you want and feel and do who you want and feel. But this sexual revolution is more along the ideas of identity and gender conforming or gender non-conforming. So when you hear about, terminology that includes something saying sexual revolution, how do you identify that in the community, the communities that you interact in? And is it different than maybe the families that you've grown up in, or, the tighter knit community of your family and friend circle?
I guess
All
I'll
right,
go
I'll call
first.
on Ryan first.
Oh, okay.
Christine, you can
Chancey
go.
Creek by Technology Programs at Andrew High Scale Rail in Talking Book Library. Coming up Thursday, Intro to Clubhouse with Accessibility in Mind. Intro to Clubhouse with Accessibility in Mind, Thursday, August 5th, 5:00–6:30 p.m.
Sorry about that. Ryan?
I think that when I think about sexual revolution today, I feel sort of a disconnect with the community in which I was raised. I come from a mostly Caribbean, Black immigrant community, and that environment is not very conducive to the ideas of sexual liberation, the ideas of liberation from gender binaries and things of that sort. I have been taught that sex is something that can only occur first and foremost between a married man and a married woman, and usually the end goal of that is procreation. And so that has been a sort of interesting experience going into school and going onto the internet and social media, seeing that we're in a time where people are beginning to rebel against these more conservative aspects. It's been very interesting for me on a personal level because these ideas that are ingrained into my culture and my community come from colonialism and come from Europeans striving to oppress my ancestors. And they use these ideas to paint my ancestors as savages because they were more sexually liberated. And so it's very interesting for me, and it's a great experience for me to see people rebelling against traditional gender roles and beginning to see casual sex and to see sex between people of all across the gender spectrum as valid and as amazing.
Awesome. How about you, Christine?
I'd like to build on what Ryan said. I too come from a Caribbean immigrant background. The ideas around sexuality in my family have been very conservative, but the conservatism was more so coming from survivability rather than colonialism, even though colonialism does play a part. But my family is from a developing country where the more children you had, the more hands you had to run the family business. So there really wasn't a lot of room for sexual exploration and identity and soul searching of that kind. I think it's interesting now, especially in 2021 and even before then, how there has just been this pushback of those ideals and tolerance that has come with it, with being openly gay, being openly LGBT, being openly open to casual sex. So it does sometimes conflict with me in terms of values, but I wholeheartedly believe in live and let live. As long as they're not hurting anyone, it should be fine. And as long as it's legal, it should be fine. So from someone on the outside looking in, it's more so just people doing their own thing, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Marta, how about you?
Okay, so I come from a very religious Catholic family, the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So I was taught to not really accept the belief of a man and a man together and a woman together. So growing up, like it was instilled in me that like a man and a woman like are like the ideal family.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so growing up I wasn't super exposed to like the LGBTQ world until about middle school, where it kind of started being more prevalent in society again. Like I feel like in the like early like 2010s, there was like a higher resurgence of the LGBTQ community. So I've sort of had different perspectives, just not knowing a whole lot of information, but then over the years learning from what social media has put out there and what like TV shows and movies have also put out there. So it's been quite a learning experience for me, especially because my family has different values, views, and opinions.
So I want to carry that idea a little bit further, and then I want to tell you guys a quick story about some of my process. But carrying that idea further, television shows, movies, a lot of social media, you know, when you go into school, when you go into various work settings or the other communities that you're involved in, how much of the LGBTQ community do you see? And, you know, even you can even share with us if you've had anybody personally in your life, you know, come out in any of the various phases of the LGBTQ spectrum. Let's go backwards. We'll start with Marta first this time.
In my middle school, there was one openly gay person, and it was kind of like interesting that like this one boy like decided like who he was at like such a young age, like 13, 14. So I think it kind of surprised everyone in the community just because people weren't very exposed to that.
Do you think that helped
like
your peers?
In the past?
Do you think that helped your peers understand that maybe he didn't so much decide who he was as he accepted who he was and was ready to live in his truth?
I think it did help my peers like with realizing there's other like
Ways to feel or ways to
like other like I don't know, like not lifestyles, or like there's other couples besides like a man and a woman together.
That must have been interesting in middle school. Was there a lot of talk around it, or did it kind of just become normal?
From what I remember, there was a little bit of talk around it, but then like after a while, it's like okay, live your life, to be who you want to be. And of course, there was like some criticism, but also a lot of like supporters.
Nice.
So,
How about you, Christine? How about from your perspective? What have you encountered so far?
It's interesting. The legislation that made LGBT plus marriage legal federally was passed when I was 15 or 16 in high school. And at that time, I think I had one friend who was questioning, but was leaning more towards the LGBT. The legislation actually got passed during Regents, which, if you live in New York State or you go to school in New York State, is a very stressful time, test taking time. So a lot of us weren't really like taken aback by the legislation being passed. We were very accepting of it. I think that during that time, anyone had qualms about the legislation, they kept it to themselves. Because I do remember that if there was anyone being openly homophobic, it was quick to be shut down by the group. So the attitude towards that legislation being passed in that community during that time, and this is in like 2015 or yeah, around 2015, was very accepting, at least for me.
Ryan?
I remember very viscerally a memory of being somewhere between 7 and 10 years old and being in the pediatrician's office. And at that doctor's office, all the doors would be open. So you could hear conversations throughout the whole office. It was a pretty small office. So in another room, I remember hearing a young man talking about something related to being gay. I think he said he saw a play about a gay man or something like that. And I remember turning to my mother and going, "Mommy, what's gay?" And she said, "You don't need to know that." And it was almost one of those moments where when an adult tells a child like not to do something, then they become obsessed with doing it. I was like, I have to figure this out. So I would ask, a lot of people around school, and I would ask my friends from church and things of that sort. And as I grew, I began to learn more about it. And I feel that it was always something that was not the worst thing in the world. It was acceptable. In certain environments, there was a strong toxic masculinity among my peers. And so it was not that the gay people in my school, specifically the gay men in my school, were being harassed or were being bullied. But it was kind of a situation where it was like, don't bring any of that around me. Or you could tell that they were visibly uncomfortable speaking about those issues or speaking to a gay man. I do remember there were a lot of out kids in my high school. We didn't have a prom because, of COVID. I just graduated this year, but there were a lot of out couples. There were a few just, relationships, high school drama, things of that sort. I have never come into contact with a trans person or non-binary person in school, but I do know several of them. I feel that almost maybe 98% of my friends are either queer in some aspect, or they're non-binary or trans non-binary, because the queers stick together. But I feel that my journey of learning has just expanded so much in my short life, and I'm learning more every day, and it's just a great experience.
So follow-up question for you, Ryan, because I think you've had the most exposure, and full disclosure, I grew up in Staten Island, New York, just a bridge and a skip and a jump from Brooklyn. Do you feel that attitudes were more gentle towards persons who were born in a female body who, come out as either lesbian or non-binary or gender fluid than their male counterpart or their born male counterparts?
Yes. And it's very difficult for me to admit that simply because of misogyny, because misogyny is a big deal, and it is women are oppressed in huge ways. But I will say in that way, there's a lot more acceptance among all people, not just cis straight men, in terms of accepting people who are assigned female at birth who are queer. And I don't have no type of sociology degree, but I feel that it really does boil down to the toxic standards that we hold men to, and the machismo that's very ingrained in my culture. I will say something very interesting that I learned recently is that part of the reason why there's a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation in Jamaica, which is not where I'm from. I'm Panamanian, but there's a lot of Jamaicans in my community, and we share a lot of cultural identity. But part of the reason why there's a lot of that legislation is because during the colonial era, a lot of European slave masters would rape Black African men as slaves to show their dominance over them. And it comes down to today, where you can see that there's a much more disgust with people who are assigned male at birth who end up being queer later in life or realize their queerness later in life than people who are assigned female at birth.
Yeah. So I'd like to invite our generous and supportive hosts into the conversation, and I'd like to ask them to take a journey back in their experience and come to the time and place where you would have been an intern, where you would have been at this their age. And what do you remember of attitudes around you and your communities versus what we're hearing from these great interns? Nazreen, why don't you go first?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Anthony. Great question. As I do remember back in those days when I was in high school and interning in college and stuff, the LGBT community back then, or the Pride community back then, was almost non-existent, unfortunately. And people were basically in the closet about their situations, their likes, dislikes, and it was not known. It was not spoken outside in the school playground, outside in the gym locker rooms. It was not spoken. And if you were so quote unquote, let's say, caught, even maybe looking at somebody too long, maybe a male looking at somebody else, another male in the gym locker room too long, or vice versa, a female, let's say, in the gym locker room looking at someone too long, it seemed like all of a sudden these assumptions came out of the woodwork, like, oh no, they must be gay. And so gay at that point, I mean, I don't even think lesbian and all these other letters were part of the whole entire tagline or label. It was mainly gay. Gay or lesbian were the two. That was it. You were either this or you were either that. The transvestite community didn't really exist, so that was a new one. And if you were out in the community, showing off your, I guess, sexual preference in these areas, you were shunned, and sometimes even thrown stones at, to be honest with you, and sometimes even gang beat up or gang jumped out there. It was just craziness. And so a lot of the community, the gay and lesbian community, did all of their sort of connection and communication and networking within closed doors, behind closed doors, and in events that were just suited to them, that were underground, maybe in someone's sub basement or something, and there was like 6-7 people that showed up, but it was a very small, relatively knit community, slowly chartering that pathway, slowly speaking of it. It's almost like a whisper. Are you gay? Yes. Are you lesbian? Yes. It was like a whisper. It was not like today's Pride that's shouty loudy, and just sis boom bomb, and like you've got that Mickey Mouse t-shirt on with those rainbow rainbow ears and whatnot. That was never heard of. Like you would never parade around outside with anything like that that showed pride. And rainbow was, you know, at that time I don't even think the symbolism of the rainbow was even given to the community at all. It was so under the carpet and so not talked about, and everything was closed doors about it. Being homophobic, that was like, that's a big word. Being homophobic was like, you know, everybody was homophobic. There was a lot of like few people were less acceptance of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
When there were instances and the word homophobic would be used, all these, you know, all these characterizations of, well, they're just acting out of their normal feelings.
Yeah.
And what would you expect? Of course, they're homophobic because that's what's natural.
Yeah.
Yes. How about you, Stephanie?
When you asked the question, I immediately choked because it was like, oh my God, he's seriously asking me to go back and remember. I can remember a couple different things. I remember as a teenager being hit on by another young woman at that time. She was a little bit older than me. But back then I really didn't understand what being gay meant. I just didn't understand it. I knew it from a perspective, like a biblical perspective, because I too, like Marta, grew up in a family that was extremely religious. Not my immediate family, but my sort of cousins and everything. So I was exposed to it by my aunt and the uncle. And, you know, through my religion, we were taught that, you know, sex could only happen between a man and a woman. And that was sort of, you know, bred into me. So I didn't understand it. And I think I had to actually have somebody break it down to me. And I remember feeling just a little afraid, but it wasn't because of, I think, the person, because I think deep inside of me, I still understood this is another human being. And just because she thinks differently than I do or believes differently than I do really shouldn't matter. But I was young and I just didn't understand. So then jump ahead a few years later to the age where these guys are now, like early 20s. I remember the AIDS epidemic and just people being so frightened, and just the vitriol of people blaming the gay community for it. And I remember, even with my religious beliefs, I remember being upset about that, because my thing was, it doesn't matter how it came about. These are people, these are human beings. These are human beings who are being prosecuted because of the way that they live. And I really personally couldn't have cared less where the disease originated or how it came into being. What bothered me was how we were just demonizing people who were different than some of the rest of us. I did not like that. That made me feel uncomfortable. And I made it known among my friends that it just wasn't right. You know, we needed to educate ourselves. And it's funny how we're sort of there now with this whole Corona thing, you know, the AIDS thing, and now the Corona thing, and just not understanding how it was spread and that type of thing. But for me, it was more about treating people as humans. And I think that's something I've always believed. So regardless of even my religious philosophies and everything, for me, it boiled down to humanity. I do remember not too long ago meeting someone who became a very, very close friend of mine. And she actually worked with me on Bold Blind Beauty. And she wrote a book, and she was telling me about this book that she wrote. And so I read it, I bought it, I read it. And then I broke down crying, because she felt that she could not tell me that she had transitioned she was born as a male and transitioned to a female. When I knew her, she was female. I accepted her as female. And I could have cared less that she was male and transitioned into it. That didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was I loved this person. And I felt bad that she felt that she couldn't share that with me because she was afraid that I would withdraw my friendship from her. It almost destroyed me. And I don't think that anybody should feel like that. So, when you ask the question, how did I personally feel about LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community? I have a lot of gay friends, a lot of lesbian friends, just friends of all varieties. And it doesn't matter to me, whether they're able, disabled, gay or not. It just doesn't matter. What matters is how we treat one another and respecting one another and just, really being there for one another, one human to another human. I hope that answers your question. I feel like I went off on a tangent.
It's your experience, and that's what we're looking for in this conversation.
For me, Anthony, if I can just add something, is I do remember the whole AIDS thing that she was talking about, because I was just like, right behind her as far as age and all that, and decades. And I remember the whole AIDS thing, and everybody was like, and it was all attributed to the gay and lesbian community at the time. I personally knew nothing about the lifestyle or what gay or lesbian really meant. And sometimes people would just, as heterosexual people, they would just throw around the term, oh, you're gay, you're this, you'd be, and then I don't even think some of the heterosexual kids at the time really knew what that was all about, what being gay really meant, and what the feelings or the essence of that was, unless maybe they were in a relationship, because everybody was so scared to come out. And when AIDS bloomed, it was just like, oh, we have to blame this one community. And then a lot more started coming out because people were like, the AIDS activists were talking about it, and all this other stuff came out about the lifestyle of being gay and what that really meant. That there are people, like Steph said, there are people with feelings, emotions, they're human as well too. What does this really mean? So it was a bit of an uproar, but it gave that term homophobia that I talked about, it kind of just helped. It kind of, I guess, it was like a ripple in the word homophobia, because people were now trying to take a second look at what is a gay lifestyle? What does it mean to be gay or lesbian? What is that? There were other words I will not repeat here, but there was another F word that was used a lot to describe people. And again, heterosexuals would just toss it out there at people because they were mad at them or whatever. They would just use that word. It made no sense or rhyme to it. But now if I think back about it, it was like, wow, did I ever, was I really part of that kind of society? Because if I talk to my daughter today about gay, lesbian, LGBT, the whole entire community, she's more or less like mom, to them it's like nothing. It's like, it's just like breathing air. It's just like everybody's equal and same, like Steph was saying. But with the generation I grew up in, no, you couldn't be openly gay, you couldn't be openly lesbian, you couldn't even tell anybody you were. And if you did anything that was a little bit out of the ordinary, let's say you wore pink rosy glasses, sunglasses, or you wore things that were like, I mean, I don't even know what they described as gayism as symbols back then, because there really wasn't anything. But if you liked another girl and you told her, or you liked another guy and you told him, that hit the roof. And so it was all under the carpet. You had to go underground.
We would need hours and hours to go through LGBTQ history, and I'm an advocate for incorporating more of this into educational standards. But if you think back even before us, our parents' generation in the 50s and 60s, not only was it a crime to be a homosexual in any form, but in establishments, if you served alcohol to someone who is openly homosexual, you also, straight, gay, whatever you were, but just serving them was an illegal, you'd get arrested for that. And that's, that's pre-Stonewall, and that's a lot of what led up to Stonewall. And a lot of folks out there think that Stonewall started the, the LGBTQ activism, and it really didn't. But it was, it was without a doubt the biggest and the biggest turning point for the movement up to that point. And then came along HIV/AIDS, which forced the community, who had been, making small steps, very, very minuscule steps up to that point, to really blow the doors off the closet, not just open them, not even kick them open, but blow the doors off and say, hey, enough. You're ascribing a worldwide epidemic to us just because it hit us harder. And the reason it hit us harder is because we've had to hide in the shadows. So, in essence, you caused all of this, is a lot of what the activism was surrounding, that time period. And then it morphed into, as some of the interns had said, the gay marriage movement. I wanted to tell a story because I think it really illustrates, a good movement, a good illustration of how things have moved. When I was in high school, you could say my last year and a half of high school, I was questioning, and I'm doing the air quotes. I really didn't, if I look back now, obviously I see all kinds of things that it could have been foreshadowing or clues. But at that point, I played baseball. I worked hard. I had 2 jobs, baseball, school, and helping to take care of, my sister. So I didn't even have time to think about who I am, what I am. I just needed to get through the day. And I played baseball, and one of my good friends was going out with one of the cheerleaders at the time. And in senior year, they broke up, and no one knew what had been going on. But close to the time of prom, she came out with her girlfriend and wanted to attend prom with her girlfriend. And this caused, there was even newspaper articles about it in Staten Island, New York. It caused a huge, I don't even know what to call it, just huge discussion, which, as someone else mentioned, she was a cheerleader. She had rocks and soda. She had things thrown at her. People spit in her face. It was bad. It was really, really bad. Fast forward a couple of years, I think it was 7 or 8 years later, I had heard that my high school had, incorporated an LGBTQ alliance. And I was like, wow, okay. And 2 or 3 years, what I can say is 10 years to the date of my prom, there was a prom queen. And so in the space of 10 years, and a lot of that I think has to do with the, the LGBTQ marriage movement, in the space of 10 years, attitudes had changed so dramatically. And speaking to some of my, I have 76 cousins, and I'm closer to the older range. So speaking to some of my younger cousins, it was like, yeah, no, there are so many out people, and, everybody's questioning, and everybody questions for a small period of time in their life. And I don't know necessarily if that's true or not. I think a lot more people question than will admit to it, but I don't think every single person questions. I think there are some people who know what their lane is, and they're very comfortable with it. But I tell this story because I want to change the focus of the conversation now to, there's a lot of pushback, with all of the different social movements that are going on. I think people feel freer to push back also to the LGBTQ community. And I've seen articles and diatribes basically saying that because of TV, because of movies, because of so many out celebrities, et cetera, that kids are, I'm using the air quotes again, being brainwashed into gender identity issues. And so I think that this conversation is really, really important for lots of reasons, but dispelling the myth that, being exposed to it is going to make you think you are Ed. I want to go back to the interns, and I'll ask Christine to start. Have you encountered pushback to persons that you've seen that are out and happy, whether they be gender fluid or, a straight L or a straight G, or even, you said you haven't really experienced T yet, but have you seen a lot of pushback or hatred or negativity?
Yes and no. Again, I live in New York. New York is a very liberal state, especially the city. So there hasn't been much overt pushback. It's more covert. I do kind of want to talk about transgender pushback that I have seen online.
Because that is a separate
Um,
huge problem. But go ahead.
oh, um, yeah. So with the Tokyo Olympics that are happening right now, there was a heavyweight lifter. I think her name is Laurel Hubbard from New Zealand. Yeah. She
Yeah.
came out as transgender, like she identified as a woman. And she wanted to compete in women's heavy lifting. And there was a lot of pushback because people were saying that since she was born a man, she should compete in the men's heavy lifting because men are biologically stronger, or they can just deadlift more. And the IOC was like, no, if she identifies as a woman, she can compete as a woman. And there was just a lot of pushback and discourse because, they were saying like, oh, if anyone can just say they identify as a woman, then how do you know their intentions are genuine? How do you know like they're not just doing this to cheat or things like that? In terms of like gender fluid, or like lesbian and gay. I've had gay employers that were openly gay. I didn't have a problem with them. We hit it off pretty well. I will say that I think when I was going to high school in 2015, we all acted a certain way that was quote unquote normal. But then after we graduated was when a lot of people either came out or they transitioned or they just felt like they had more freedom to find themselves and be themselves. Because even if the environment was more accepting back then, it still wasn't perfect. There were still people that would make fun of you, would make jokes, whatever. And sometimes just for people's own preservation, it's better to keep it under wraps until you have a way to get out and then be yourself.
Oh, yeah,
That's been my experience.
yeah. Ryan, to the original premise, do you think that representation in movies, television, major celebrities and buyout pieces, all of that, do you think it opened the door for more acceptance? Or do you think that there's any validity in the fact that it might be brainwashing young folks into thinking that they need to question and experiment, or they're not right?
No, I do not think that representation is brainwashing anyone. There are so many people online, a lot of these, people on YouTube will say, well, this means that Hollywood has a gay agenda. This means that whatever entity that is producing all the media that we're consuming has a gay agenda. That's not necessarily true at all. I think media is such an important media is such an important tool for people to feel seen. When I was in middle school, the idea of someone being non-binary did not even come across my mind. However, as I've grown, I've seen more of that in the media and I've been able to learn more about that. That doesn't mean that I automatically become non-binary. However, I think that it has enabled people who are non-binary to understand that. Because if you're not given the language to understand who you are, then you're left trying to search for labels your entire life and not really fully understanding who you are. And I think having those characters on television and just seeing certain influencers being themselves on social media can be a great opportunity to not only educate people about the community so that when they come into contact with people who are queer, they're like, okay, I've seen this on social media, I understand this, I can be more compassionate, but also it can help people who are in the community better understand themselves and better grasp where they need to go. And it can also help just give people a support system, because it can be very easy to feel alone and isolated when you're a part of that community. So it's just all around, I think it's a good thing. It ain't brainwashing nobody. I think those people saying that need to relax. No offense.
Martha, when you heard myself, Stephanie, and Nazreem, speaking about our quote unquote, I'm using the air quotes again, the back in the day, experiences, do you feel that it's moved away from that, or it's in the process of moving away from society itself is moving away from those experiences? Or do you think it's just kind of hidden under a rock right now?
Of people being more comfortable with the pride community.
Yes, and less homophobic outwardly.
Yeah, so my mom's a teacher, and she has had more over the past like year or 2 years now, have had more students that identify as gay, lesbian, trans. So I know it's been like a learning experience, because all of a sudden you have like all these kids that are like feel super comfortable with like being who they are. And I do feel like that has a lot to do with like TV shows, movies, celebrities like being their true selves, and and then they become like a role model for these kids to feel more comfortable in their own skin. I don't think that's brainwashing, but sometimes I do experience people saying like it's a trend for these children, and they're at such a young age. How could they possibly like understand their sexual orientation? I also feel like when you like teach health now, the definition of like sex and having a family is like between a man and a woman, and that's very like outdated now, and all these kids feel left out because they're like, that's not my story, that's not like what I believe.
Yeah.
And because the what's it called, because the like criteria for teaching doesn't say like sexes can be between a man and a man, or a man and a man and a man, and a woman and a woman, and all the other scenarios. Teachers aren't allowed to say that because it's not allowed, or it hasn't been changed by government standards. So yeah, kids feel misrepresented, and I think that's a shame. And some kids like go to school and they're like, oh, I identify as this and this, but at home they're still in the closet, so to speak. So it's like, where do you draw the line of like acceptance and understanding?
Here's a question I didn't expect to actually ask you guys, but I think at this point in the conversation, it's pretty good to bring up. Do you all know and feel, in your your souls, that being on the LGBTQ spectrum in whatever form, it's not a choice. It's it's an expression of who you are inside. Has your generation come that far that, do you think your generation in general understands it's not a choice? It just is who we are? Ryan, you go first.
I think we have come to that place 100%. I think people no longer think that being on any part of the LGBTQ spectrum is someone deciding one day to do that. I don't think that minimizes the hatred and still the fear of queer people, because a lot of these there are homophobic people in our generation, and they may understand that being queer is not a choice, but they still feel that it's disgusting or that it's wrong or things of that sort.
Christine?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. For me, I think we have gotten to the point where we understand that it's not a choice, but there's also now a new understanding that this identity is dynamic. So, you go through the questioning phase and let's say you become lesbian, but now with these new identities like pansexual, someone could realize they're pan. So it's not a choice, but it's also not linear. It can change, it can fluctuate.